become totally exhausted and bored by the contemporary political climate conversation, just the flat horizontal binary of you're either conservative or you're liberal, you're either Democrat, you're Republican, and
right or left,
and then you just you if you're a Catholic, you just try to like find your place somewhere in there, but that in practice means most Catholics end up on one side or another and just identifying with one party or another.
But no, never talk about politics behind the pulpit, because that would be bad.
Well, yeah,
there's this tension that's always existed in a liberal democracy.
But yeah, what I've noticed and what you've helped me to see, Doctor, is that if you take like a hard right-wing Republican and a crazy left-wing Democrat, and those two people think that they're operating according to completely different worldviews. Mm-hmm. But what you've helped me to see is that actually they're operating within the same fundamental worldview, mm-hmm. which is the worldview of modernity, which all of us have inherited and which all of us are swimming in and take for granted as though it's natural.
Right, exactly.
And you've helped me to kind of break outside of that worldview, step outside of it, and see that there's another way of understanding reality mm-hmm. that actually this modern worldview replaced, mm-hmm. And that is actually much more. It's actually a fruit of Christianity, a fruit of
Absolutely
the gospel.
Right.
It's interesting because to most people that consider the church as this medieval idea of civility and the church's relationship to the state, they think about her as some medieval know-nothings, terrible, let's get this out of our
Dark Ages.
Dark Ages, right. Not important, didn't really have many principles of operating, other they were just kind of gold threads, nice fabrics, crown, saying yes and no to things.
Right.
And then the Inquisition somehow was mixed into that kind of worldview.
Well, what's funny about that is that normally in our world, when people think of the stuff that occupies their brain, the mental furniture about the Middle Ages is almost, if it bears any resemblance to reality, it's actually the early modern period. Mm. It's actually the absolute monarchs and the confessional churches, mm-hmm. and Cardinal Richelieu and right, and which is the sort of boogeyman that liberalism fights against.
Sure. That's right.
Right, but it's that understanding that that period, that absolutist confessional state period, is itself shares a worldview with liberalism. I mean, that's why what you said was interesting, because this is something I explain to my students often, is that history, especially liberals, especially moderns, we tend to tell the story of history as if there's a progressive push, like history's moving in one direction, and so there's one group that's fighting forward, and then there's another group that's resisting, mm-hmm. right? And they're diametrically opposed. But what actually, the mainstream of history, normally, what you actually see is parallel movements, right? They're both going in the same direction, and the fighting is sort of inside it. It's not one guy going forward, one guy going back. It's a squabble.
It's a
squabble between two groups that are both more or less pushing in the same direction, mm-hmm. right? And that so again, the Middle Ages, like the authentic Middle Ages, the pre-modern Christendom is almost forgotten.
Yeah,
it kind of just fades from view. We just sort of assume it's what Louis XIV was.
Start with who you start with in the chapter, which is Pope Innocent III. Mm-hmm. Why did you choose him as a figure through which to try to understand the medieval world?
Innocent is one of the more famous popes of the Middle Ages. To the extent any pope from the Middle Ages is famous, right? Yeah. Among historians, he's a famous pope. And he's famous for being, one of the most famous books on him is called Lord of the World.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so he's famous for being the medieval papacy at its highest, at its most worldly power, most powerful in a worldly way, right? When the Pope was sort of the ruler of Europe and deposing kings and, mm-hmm. in charge of Christendom. And so he's normally treated as sort of a secular figure, right? As a figure who constructed the church as a sort of super state, mm-hmm. right? And therefore is in conflict with the kings and is that kind of idea. So the church that we repudiate in modernity, Innocent III is like the man for that. Mm. But that's wrong. Okay, so that's what I try. That's the reason why I pick him, because if the whole church-state distinction. So normally the story of the Middle Ages is told from moderns as the story of the movement towards the putting of Christianity in its place, right? So we have a world where where religion is all mixed up with politics and religion is all mixed up with economics, and that world is bad and corrupt and it shouldn't be that way.
Yep.
And then we have this long process, excuse me, of the creation of the secular state, the creation of secular thought. It's tied in often with like science and stuff. And that is the pushing of religion into its proper sphere, which is this domestic, private, moral sphere.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
Which obviously is an understanding of history that posits. I mean, really, it's sort of like the Declaration of Independence is the point of all of history. Everything is moving towards Thomas Jefferson. Yeah. And so the whole story is going to be told about how we sorted the world properly to get to Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah. That's,
right.
That's what exactly. Going to public school my whole life, talking to people who went to public school. That is
George Washington.
That's that is the story.
This is the
right.
But you're saying that's wrong.
Yes. Yeah. I think that it actually is wrong methodologically. It's wrong factually. It's very wrong theologically and philosophically. I mean, what that narrative assumes from the beginning is that the categories of modernity are the categories of existence itself.
Yeah.
Right. So you are essentializing these concepts like state and church. And then you go back into the Middle Ages and say, look, the state and the church were all mixed up together. Right. Well, no, actually, the process of modernity is the process of creating those two different things, the state and the church.
Yeah.
Right. And it's not so in the Middle Ages, in the 13th century, the state and the church didn't cooperate. They didn't have an alliance. They weren't fighting with each other. They didn't exist.
The people wouldn't have thought in those categories.
Exactly.
No, the church was all the baptized.
Yeah.
Right. The state didn't exist at all. The word actually is invented by Machiavelli. I mean,
right.
it doesn't even. They don't even have that concept. They have the concept of the spiritual and the temporal powers, right, of clergy and laity. But those do not map on in any way, shape, or form to the modern concepts of church and state. They don't. It's actually the construction of church and state is the process of destroying both the spiritual and the temporal powers and turning them into something else.
Yeah.
Right. And so that means that if you adopt the contemporary categories, the modern categories unreflectively, then you have to, when you look backwards, what you're going to see is confusion, chaos, disorder, right? Because the pieces that you've put in those categories are not where they ought to be.
Yeah.
Right. But that's an illusion, right? That's not the way the people who are actually there experienced it.